Remember that whole winter solstice thing when it was black as night and uh, for 20 hours plus? Well, we are at the opposite. We are just before the summer solstice, and so it's exactly the opposite. There's like this much nighttime, which you never really see if you sleep like a person. And I am enjoying it quite a bit. I'm loving it's my fourth year here, and I'm at the expansion contraction of the seasons. Well, I've chatted about that before. All right, we move now into chapter 18, right? Look at where we are, right? Look here. See. Chapter 18 of Anyone Got a Match by Max Schulman. Chapter 18. Gabriel drove rapidly, but not recklessly, away from Big Eddie's. He did not want to endanger the precious cargo he carried in his sports car, the reel of tape with which he would dissolve the marriage of Polly and Ira Shapian, thus making Polly free to become his wife. His hunch, Gabriel told himself with grim satisfaction as he speeded toward Acanthus College, had not been wrong. Polly was out of love with Ira. That is why she had been spending so much time with Virgil. Her feeling for Ira was dead. Only habit and inertia kept the union together. Love was gone. Gabriel had proof of it now, this spool of tape, this incontrovertible recording, testimony beyond refuting. But Gabriel took no pleasure in what he had to do next, play the tape for Ira Shapian. It was a devastating blow to inflict on a man so sensitive. And yet, thought Gabriel, he must be cruel only to be kind. Certainly Mr. Shapian deserved better than a wife who had stopped loving him. When the initial shock had passed, he would probably thank Gabriel. And even if he did not, even if he hated Gabriel ever afterward, the fact would remain that a mockery of a marriage had been terminated. As long as Polly and Ira stayed together, neither had a chance for happiness. Once asunder, the prospects for both were immeasurably brighter. Mr. Shapian, in spite of his advanced years, was still a colorful figure, and surely he would somewhere, sometime, find a woman who would love him truly. As for Polly, she already had Gabriel. Yes, thought Gabriel, as he drove through the gate of Acanthus, he was doing the right thing, the only thing, the human thing. Carrying the tape, he went looking for Ira and found him in the gymnasium, which had been converted into a television studio. Ira was directing a camera rehearsal. To Gabriel's inexperienced eyes, it seemed like an outbreak in a violent ward. Technicians screamed, cursed, dashed, spun, and jittered. Only Ira was undisturbed. Calmly, softly, steadily, he issued orders. Move number 3 in closer, Mr. Harris, said Ira. I'm getting effing Mike Shadow, cried the operator of camera number 3. Raise your boom, Mr. Santini, said Ira to the sound man. It's on this effing ceiling right now, yelled the sound man. Dolly him back, Mr. Cohen, said Ira to the laborer who pushed the boom carriage. He'll knock over my effing brute, roared the electrician who held a huge arc light behind the boom. All right, Mr. Cohen. Crab, said Ira to the boom pusher. The man crimped the wheels, moved the boom backward at such an angle that he missed the arc light by a clean inch. Now move number 3, Mr. Harris, said Ira, and the camera rolled closer. Still got Mike Shadow? Asked Ira. No, admitted the camera operator. Mark it, Mr. Dooley, said Ira, and a laborer slapped ribbons of adhesive tape on the floor to indicate the precise spots where the camera and microphone must stop rolling. Next setup, Mr. Schultz, said Ira to the script clerk. The script clerk consulted his notebook and said, Lab number 4, cameras 1, 2, and 6, 2 booms. An overlapping chorus of howls erupted immediately. That's the smallest effing set on the stage, said the cameraman. I can't get 3 effing machines in there. Where the hell am I going to put 2 effing booms? Asked the sound man. How do I get lights into this effing mishmash? Demanded the electrician. Kill camera 2, Mr. Harris, said Ira placidly to the cameraman. Mr. Santini, use 1 boom and 2 lavalier mics, was his soft answer to the sound man. Stick obies on the cameras, Mr. Keefe, he said in an unruffled voice to the electrician. All right, gentlemen, let's move to set number 4. Ira, followed by the technical director, the script clerk, and the assistant director, started towards set number 4, a replica of one of Dr. Solenko's laboratories. Meanwhile, crewmen fixed tiny bright spotlights to the bottoms of the cameras and got ready to wheel equipment into position. Gabriel chose this moment of relative quiet to seize Ira. Hi, Mr. Shapian, he said. Hello, Gabriel, said Ira. Goodbye, Gabriel. Please, sir, insisted Gabriel, touching Ira's sleeve. I have to talk to you. Talk? Ira regarded the boy in pop-eyed disbelief. Are you crazy or what? I've got to get this mess on the air in less than 4 hours, and you want to sit and talk? Just a couple of minutes, said Gabriel, supplicatingly, earnestly, urgently. That's all I want. 2 minutes. I promise you, sir, there will be the most of your entire life. Ira looked and was impressed. All right, talk. Privately. Now, listen, son. Please? Ira met Gabriel's eyes, passionate black plagiarisms of his own. How could he refuse his very flesh and blood? And moreover, this very night, Ira was going to Boo Beach House where, who could tell, he might at last reach the decision that would make him Gabriel's legal as well as actual father. Back in 2 minutes, said Ira to his assistants. Come on, he said to Gabriel, and led him across the quadrangle to his office. What is it, boy? And fast. Have you got a tape recorder? Ira pointed to a machine on a table beside his desk. Gabriel put on the spool of tape he was carrying, threaded it, switched on the recorder, and sat. The machine talked, and Ira listened. For 90 seconds, the tape unreeled, and Ira, quite still, listened. With each passing second, his face grew more blank. He did not pale, he did not redden. It was as though all his powers of feeling, thought, and motion had suddenly, quietly ceased. Shall I play it again? Asked Gabriel. No, said Ira. His voice was steady, but not much like his. Gabriel peered at him curiously. Sir, did you understand what you just heard? Yes. That was Mrs. Shapian speaking. The man was Virgil Tatum. Yes. I think you are in shock, sir, said Gabriel. Maybe. Can I get you some water? No. Look, sir, if you want to cry or scream or anything, please feel free. Thank you. Would you care to hit me? I mean hard. No, thank you. I've got it coming, Mr. Shapian. That was a lousy, sneaky thing I did. Following your wife, making that tape. That was the lowest thing I ever did in my life, and I want you to know I'll never stop being ashamed of it. Never. Fine. And I know you'd get all shook up when I played you the tape. Not this shook up, maybe, but shook up. Still, what's right is right. Who is more entitled to this information than you? What? I am saying, sir, that I didn't have any choice. I had to play the tape for you because the next move is yours. Move? Are you sure you don't want any water, Mr. Shapian? Yes. Can I feel your pulse? No. I wish you'd let me because there's no other way I can tell how bad off you anything. Give me your pulse, please, sir. No. I'm watching the veins in your neck, which is also a pulse. It seems to be beating normally, so I'm going to assume you're not in dangerous trauma, even though you just had this terrible shock. Believe me, sir, I wish I could wait a few days to tell you what I'm about to tell you now, because I'm well aware this is the wrong time and place for conversation, especially since your attention span is so short, and the things I have to say are real deep and philosophical. But consider this. Chances are you'll never let me anywhere near you for the rest of your life, so I've got to speak right away, even if the circumstances aren't what you'd call ideal. Sir, I hope someday you'll forgive me for what I've done, but that's not important. What's important is that you should forgive Mrs. Shapian. Remember, sir, the nature of love is still a mystery after all these thousands and thousands of years. Nobody can explain why love hits you. Nobody can explain why love dies. What's the profit in trying to find out? It's not a science. There are no rules. Mrs. Shapian loved you, and then she stopped. Why ask why? It happened, that's all. Don't blame her. Don't blame yourself. Just keep this in mind. Life goes on, and you are still a fairly vigorous man, and there is every reason to hope that you will find another wife, maybe even a permanent one, after you divorce Mrs. Shapian. Said Ira. Yes, said Gabriel, leaning forward. You what? I have just come to a decision, said Ira. Yes, said Gabriel. The most important decision of my life, said Ira. Yes, said Gabriel. After I do what I'm going to do tonight, I will never again be able to work in commercial television, said Ira. Yes, said Gabriel. Like Samson, I am going to tear down the temple, said Ira. Sir, I don't quite understand, said Gabriel. Could we get back to the tape recording? Go home, Gabriel, said Ira. I am needed on stage. He rose resolutely to his feet and dashed out of the office. And we are not stopping here. No. We are moving into chapter 19. It will not complete the book entirely, but we will be very close. Chapter 19. The clock on the wall of the gymnasium showed 25 seconds before 8 p.m., airtime for the Acanthus telecast. Ira Shapian sat on a swivel-topped stool in a simple little set with camera number 1 focused on him and a microphone boom hanging over his head. In this set, Ira would open the show when the clock's second hand reached airtime. The catatonia which had gripped Ira upon hearing Gabriel's tape recording some hours earlier had lifted, but only in patches. He had returned to the stage after the session with Gabriel, made all preparations, improvised, invented, soothed raw nerves, repaired bruised egos, and without sweat accomplished prodigies of work. To the mob of people on stage, the crew, the sponsors' minions, the ad agency men, Clendenin, the various participants in the telecast, Ira had seemed the very model of an unflapped professional. But deep inside his soul squatted a numbness, a chill, undislodgeable blankness that was not pain but simple unbeing. There was no hysteria. He could speak cautiously. He could speak rationally, listen intelligently, move purposefully, and act decisively. What he could not do was bring himself to think about his fateful decision to use tonight's telecast as the means to bar himself forever from commercial television. He knew precisely how he would conduct this evening's program. He even knew to the last detail how he would accomplish his ostracism from commercial TV. But whenever he attempted to think of the consequences of this irrevocable act, he could summon up only nothingness. Not panic and not elation, just nothingness. His mind flatly refused to function. It was as though a door had slammed shut, blocking out all awareness. The second hand on the wall clock approached the figure 10. Ira's practiced glance made a rapid circuit of the stage, everything in order. The sets were lit, cameras and booms were on their marks, performers were stationed where they belonged. Clendenin sat in the control booth, and with him, safely out of the way, sat a gathering of important personages. A small red light beneath the lens of camera number 1 flashed red. Simultaneously, the assistant director cued Ira with an outthrust forefinger. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," said Ira, speaking directly into the camera. "Tonight, live from the campus of Acanthus College, we are going to take a very hard look at a very controversial question. Have we Americans gotten to be the biggest, strongest, healthiest people on earth because of the food we eat, and many say we have, or are we slowly, bit by bit, day by day, digging our graves with our knives and forks, and many say we are? My name is Ira Shapian. In exactly 60 seconds, we will begin our investigation." At this point, the first commercial took over the screen. Muscular young men and busty young women cavorted strenuously on a seashore, all the time smiling strenuously, all the time strenuously singing the Tatum cigarette jingle. During these jolly antics, camera number 2 rolled silently into place about 5 feet to the side of camera number 1. As the commercial ended, camera number 1 flashed red and Ira was cued to resume. "A lot of people," said Ira to camera number 1, "will wonder why we picked Acanthus College to conduct an inquiry as complex as the one we are carrying on tonight. You don't automatically think of Acanthus when you think of scholarship, at least you didn't in previous years. There used to be another word, not scholarship, that came more quickly to mind when Acanthus was mentioned. The man sitting across from me knows more about it than anybody." The red light switched on beneath the lens of camera number 2. Seated on a stool near Ira was a large, wide, lugubrious, slack-jawed man, wearing a collar one size too big and blinking porcinely into the camera. "Your name, sir," said Ira. 19 Myers. Edward Flannert Myers, actually, but they used to call me 19 on account that was my collar size. No more, though. I doubt if my neck is even 18 now. Everything's gone to hell. I understand football has been dropped at Acanthus, and a good thing. You see them specimens walking around campus? They couldn't beat a deaf and dumb school. How was it when you were coach, Mr. Myers? A nostalgic smile lifted the corners of 19's pendulous lips. I had material, friend. Wasn't a kid in the whole school couldn't lift 500 pounds. Fact is, some of them weighed pretty near that. You know, mister, we never lost one single game all the time I was coaching. I do. I also know the Association of American Universities said Acanthus scored the lowest average student IQ in all history. Can't have everything, shrugged 19. Also the lowest average faculty IQ, added Ira. They was good old guys, said 19 loyally. But gone now. Teachers gone, students gone, all gone. New bunch now. Mess of students with arms like twigs, passel of bald-head profs with vests. Who rank, again I quote the Association of American Universities, among the first 5 in the nation, both in student and faculty intelligence. As an old Acanthus man, Mr. Myers, don't you take any pride at all in the fantastic intellectual jump that's been made here? Some, admitted 19. Seems like every college you can name has got a hard-on for education lately. Well, if that's the way it is, I suppose you might as well be on top of the dunghill like we are. Sure, I'm proud of Acanthus, except on them afternoons in October and November, when I can still hear them big old boys slamming off tackle, thud, crunch, bang, 6 yards, 8 yards, sometimes all the way, and them silly happy kids standing in the end zone just flinging the ball up in the air with pure joy while the stretchers came out to pick up the defensive linemen. Call me sentimental, but I got to be honest. I miss it. 19 took out a bandana and blew his nose loudly. Off-tackle plays were kind of your specialty, weren't they? Asked Ira. Had to be, replied 19. My boys couldn't remember hardly nothing else. Thank you, Mr. Myers, for a colorful picture of Acanthus as it used to be. We switch you now to a roundtable discussion between Virgil Tatum, president of the college, and some of the new department heads. Do I have to watch? Said 19. Not if you don't want to. I sure God don't. Goodbye, Mr. Myers. Take it, Virgil Tatum. 3 new cameras went to work in another set, a grouping that consisted of a low oval table and a dozen comfortable swivel chairs. Virgil Tatum sat at the head of the table. All around him, all drinking coffee, most puffing pipes, were the heads of the various departments. The only department head absent was Linden of Arts and Cultural Anthropology. Virgil moderated the conversation with easy firmness. He let each man trot out his erudition, but briefly and without abstruseness. He leavened the talk with wit. He scotched obscure words and precious phrases immediately they were uttered. Ira stood and admired Virgil's skill for several seconds. Then suddenly Ira could not stay. The sight of Virgil abruptly, without warning, released a flood of murderous rage. A compulsion almost maniacal to run howling onto the set and strangle on camera with all America watching the man who had made him a cuckold. With a huge effort of will, Ira tore himself away from the set. He would figure out what to do about Virgil later. Right now, there was more pressing business. He walked to the control booth, ramming down his temper with each step. Calmly, he opened the door and entered. A double row of easy chairs was in the rear of the booth. Here sat important personages: Clendenin, Robert E. Lee Owens, William Ransom Owens, Dr. Andrew McAndrews, brass from the ad agency, comfortably viewing the show on the monitors above the control panel. But the most important of all the personages present, Jefferson Tatum, was not sitting, not viewing comfortably. He was on his feet, pacing and purpling the air with profanity. He descended on Ira like a Mongol horseman. God damn it, Shapian, I'm paying $1 jillion for a show about food poisons. Who gave you license to do all this crap about art, science, and the learned disciplines, whatever the hell they are? Now, Mr. Tatum, said Clendenin, smiling whitely. Shut up, you New York pimp, snarled Jefferson. Pimp, said Ira, tilting his head thoughtfully toward Clendenin. No, Tatum, I don't believe pimp has quite got it. To my way of thinking, he looks more like the leading man in a stag movie. Jokes! Yelled Jefferson, outraged to the point of disbelief. Jokes! For I'm going bankrupt, and he tells jokes. Shapian, you shitepoke, when are you going to start doing what I'm paying for? Depends on how soon you start being polite, answered Ira, staring hard at the old man. Clendenin quaked. Jefferson gathered himself for a major explosion, then saw the steeliness in Ira's eyes and quieted at once. Yes, sir, he said meekly. I'm giving Virgil 90 seconds more, said Ira. Then comes a commercial. After that, Dr. Solenko goes on. Thank you, sir, said Jefferson. That sounds real nice. Dr. McAndrews, called Ira. Yes, young man, answered McAndrews from the rear row. When Dr. Solenko finishes, there will be another commercial, then a station break, and then another commercial. I'll come fetch you while all that is going on. Excellent. Ira left and walked quickly to Dr. Solenko's set. There stood 3 tables, each bearing cages of live animals and racks of equipment. Dr. Solenko, handsome in a crisp smock, and her TV makeup, was at the center table. Flanking her at the other tables were several colleagues. Cameras covered the set from 3 different angles. Good evening, doctor, said Ira. Fine makeup job they did on you. Oh, splendid, she said. I'm wearing enough arsenic on each cheek to destroy a middle-sized city. It'll watch, Ira assured her. Did you get all your experiments completed? Just barely. In fact, the final report arrived less than a minute ago, and it's a beauty. Listen, Shapian, you couldn't by chance give me a few extra seconds tonight, could you? Sorry. No, of course not, she said bitterly. After all, the poison industry deserves equal time to rebut. That's the American way, isn't it? Please, doctor, said Ira, you're on in a few seconds. I haven't bothered you with rehearsals because I know how frantic things have been at the labs. So now, very quickly, let me tell you how it goes. When I cue you to go on the air, feel free to say whatever you like. If you want to move, the cameras will follow you. When I hold up one finger, it means you've got 1 minute left. When I cross fingers like this, it means you've got a half minute. When I do this, you're off the air. Got it? Got it. Dr. McAndrews will follow you with his rebuttal. Then comes a commercial. Then, to finish the show, I want you and McAndrews face-to-face while I ask a couple of questions. Clear? Perfectly. The assistant director whispered in Ira's ear. Ira nodded. I'll introduce you in just 5 seconds, he said to Dr. Selenko. You take it from there. The camera nearest Ira blinked red, and the assistant cued him to start. This, said Ira into the camera, is a program about the possible dangers in the food we eat. So far, we haven't mentioned food because, first, we wanted you to know the people who teach at this college are out of the very top drawer in the academic world. We're not asking you to accept opinions from any second-raters. The Acanthus faculty would do credit to any university anywhere, and I want particularly to include Dr. Clara Selenko, MD and PhD. She is the director of Acanthus School of Nutrition and Public Health. Her professional reputation is immense. Her opinions about the American food industry are violent. Dr. Selenko, you're on. Thank you, she said. Her manner was crisp and level, not so much fervent as positive, beyond the possibility of refutation. I'm here to tell you flatly, and I propose to prove it, that the American food industry, mad for profits, and the federal government, afflicted with incompetence, laziness, venality, and insufficient funds, possibly all four, are engaged in a giant conspiracy to poison you and your neighbors. A large accusation? Well, let's see. Dr. Nilet, step over here, please. A thin, bespectacled, balding man of 40, dressed in a white smock, joined Dr. Selenko. Yes, ma'am. Dr. Nilet is a member of my staff, explained Dr. Selenko. What did you do before you came to work here? Well, first I spent 2 years at Northwestern getting a PhD in biochemistry, but before that I was an inspector with FDA. Tell us what FDA is. The Food and Drug Administration, a federal agency, part of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Its duties? To inspect all foods and drugs used. Now, Dr. Nilet, how did you happen to go to work for FDA? Well, actually, I wasn't a doctor then. I had a BS in chemistry, and my grades weren't good enough for a scholarship, and I didn't have enough cash to go ahead on my own. I needed a job real bad, and to be honest, there wasn't anyone much interested in a foul ball like me, except FDA. Man, how they wooed me. You'd have thought I was Robert Oppenheimer or somebody. Well, anyhow, with nobody else bidding, I finally joined FDA as a food inspector for $4,525 a year. After you became a member of FDA, asked Dr. Selenko, how often on the average did you inspect a typical food processing plant? You're talking about an ordinary company with a good record, not somebody who is always in trouble with the law? Yes, a standard, reputable food processor, a firm whose label people automatically trusted. How often do you inspect such a plant? On the average, said Nilet, I'd drop in for a day about once every 2 years. And you'd open a few cases at random, and unless you actually found the food stinking with ptomaine or crawling with vermin, you'd give them a clean bill and stay away for another 2 years? Look, doctor, said Nilet pleadingly, I didn't like it any better than you, but there just wasn't time to do any more. Most of my days were spent in the FDA labs checking the thousands of new food additives that the processors kept sending in for approval. Ah, yes, approval. Under the law, no additive can be used without FDA approval. What tests, Dr. Nilet, determined whether you granted or withheld approval? Well, we tried the stuff on lab animals, and if they didn't die, we passed it. So, said Dr. Selenko, the criterion was, in fact, that the new additives did not have to be beneficial to humans. It only had to be non-poisonous to rats. Correct, said Dr. Nilet, and I wish you wouldn't glare at me. I did quit FDA, you know. I did go back to school and wait on table for 2 years until I learned some chemistry. I did end up smart enough to get a job with you. Sorry, doctor, she said contritely. I am filled with admiration for your courage and your talent, and I'm proud to have you aboard. Thank you. he said, mollified. You're welcome. Let's talk a bit more about food additives. Every day, you say, a flood of applications would come in from food companies asking FDA to approve some new additives. Had any research been done on the additives before FDA received them? Oh, yes, we always got long reports on each additive from some independent lab. And who paid for those long reports? The food companies. Very reassuring. Don't pout, Dr. Nilet. I am not glaring at you. I am simply wondering whether FDA accepted these outside reports or whether you ran some tests of your own. Well, we ran some tests, but of course we didn't have too many people, and more important, we didn't have too much time. How much time? The law says we have to complete our tests in 180 days, or else the product is automatically approved for market. This is the law passed by Congress and signed on September 6, 1958 by President Eisenhower with the full concurrence of the Food and Drug Administration. Yes, ma'am. In the brief period of 180 days, what kind of tests can you run? Just experiments to find out how poisonous the stuff is? No test for cancer? Oh, come now, Dr. Salenko. You know cancer tests usually take years. FDA doesn't have the staff or the money or the equipment, and besides, the law says 180 days is all you get. One final question, Dr. Nilet. Since you left FDA, have you kept in touch with any of your friends? Have you heard of any recent laws or regulations that would protect the American consumer more effectively? Yes, ma'am, I have kept in touch, and no, ma'am, there have been no new laws or regulations whatsoever. Thank you, Dr. Nilet. Will the cameras please follow me to the table on my right? With the cameras in accurate pursuit, Dr. Salenko moved to the next table, where a pair of identical jars with large uncapped mouths lay side by side. One jar was partially filled with coarse dark flour. The other jar was completely filled with snowy white flour, so completely filled that some of it was spilling out of the open mouth. The largest single item of foodstuff sold in America, said Dr. Salenko, is white bread. In order to make white bread white, I speak now of common commercial grade white bread, not of French, Italian, or other crusty breads. The flour must first be chemically emulsified, oxidized, hydrogenated, neutralized, stabilized, and, most significant, bleached with chlorine dioxide. I have just this evening completed an experiment, and I would like to show you the results. Several weeks ago, I laid these two jars down in a room in my laboratory. The jars were not covered. One jar was filled with ordinary bleached white flour. The other jar was filled with unprocessed natural whole wheat flour. Please observe. She took a scoop, moved into the jar of white flour, dipped into the jar of white flour. The camera moved in close as she sifted the flour slowly through her hand. Not a bug, not a dropping, not a speck of filth marked the whiteness of the flour. Now, said Dr. Salenko, let me apologize in advance to the squeamish, but watch this. She took a scoopful of the dark flour and sifted it slowly through her fingers. The flour was riddled with roaches, beetles, ants, and vermin. Not an appetizing demonstration, but a revealing one. The bugs had precisely the same access to the bleached flour as the whole white wheat flour. They ignored the white flour and concentrated totally on the whole wheat. Why? Because, my friends, in order to prepare the kind of flour that makes our ordinary daily bread, you first have to strip away all the nourishment. It pains me to say it, but sometimes bugs have more sense than people. In the control booth, Jefferson Tatum, watching Dr. Salenko on the monitors, cackled gleefully, slapped his knee, and turned with a smirk to Dr. Andrew McAndrews. How do you like them apples, Doc? He crowed triumphantly. McAndrews, unruffled, smiled. Very old apples, Mr. Tatum. Very old and very expected. Clendenin tried to keep the anxiety out of his voice. She's making quite a case, Dr. McAndrews. Not that I'm worried or anything, because I feel sure you've got all the answers. Bullshit, said Jefferson Tatum. Well put, agreed Miss Andrews. Mr. Tatum is correct. I don't have all the answers, and that's what keeps me ahead of the game. I know what I don't know. But you do know more than Dr. Salenko? Asked Clendenin nervously. Rest easy, said McAndrews soothingly to Clendenin. Yeah, rest easy, said Jefferson. And hush up. I want to hear what the pretty lady doctor's saying now. All fell silent and watched the monitors. Dr. Salenko had moved to another table and was showing cages of mice dying of bladder cancer induced by butter coloring. As though to television born, she kept the tempo of her presentation rapid and crackling. While the prop men switched exhibits, she moved from table to table, demonstrating the horrendous results of additives, pesticides, antibiotics, and hormones. Occasionally, she turned away from her exhibits, sat on a stool, faced the camera, and delivered a statement that trembled with tightly capped passion. Other times, she was light and dry. Once, for 3 fulminating minutes, she relinquished the camera to Dr. Levine, who attacked water as nobody had attacked it since Noah. Ira Shapian stayed in the background until it was time to give the doctor the 1-minute signal. With an imperceptible nod, she acknowledged Ira's sign. She started her peroration, unhurried, unfrantic, nor did she become over-hasty when Ira flashed her the half-minute warning. When he made the throat-cutting gesture indicating she was off the air, her argument was completed. Her points were well and forcefully made, each one. "Thank you, Doctor," said Ira. "Fine job. Now I'm going to get Dr. McAndrews to do his rebuttal. He'll work in that set over there, the one with the drape. Would you be good enough to stand close by? As soon as McAndrews is finished, I want to put the two of you together for a quick interview." "Right," said Dr. Salenko. Ira rushed to the control booth. "Sonny," said Jefferson, fervently grasping Ira's hand, "I want to tell you." "Tell me later," said Ira, yanking loose. "Dr. McAndrews, come with me, please." He escorted McAndrews to a set containing a drape and 3 stools. "Want a lectern?" asked Ira. "Got notes?" "No notes," replied McAndrews. "Fine. You sit on this stool. I'll sit on that one. There's a station break on now. Then comes a commercial, and then I'll introduce you. When you've finished your rebuttal, there's another commercial. After that, I'm going to wind up the show by putting Dr. Salenko beside you and pitching a question or two." "Good. And may I say, Mr. Shapian, I'll never know how you managed to turn this chaos into such a smooth operation." "It's called television, Doctor, but thanks." Ira felt a tugging at his sleeve. "Excuse me, Ira," said Clendenin, his face mild, his eyes burning with tightly held excitement. "I know you're on after the next commercial, but could I see you for just a few seconds?" "This better be damn important," said Ira, following Clendenin to a quiet corner. "Honey lover, would I bug you at a time like this if it wasn't?" "So?" "Take a look at McAndrews sitting there." "So?" "See how his eyes dart around? See how he soaks up everything? See how fascinated he is?" "So?" "He's been like that all day. Ira, baby, my radar tells me, and it's never wrong, that this distinguished Nobel Prize winner, this kindly, cragging, reassuring, heartwarming, gentle—" "The point, Clendenin, for God's love, the point." "Don't you see it, Ira, baby? This eminent physician, loaded with years and honors, is stage-struck. He's hooked by show business. And look how great he looks in makeup." "Aha! Now I dig. We do a new hospital series. We find some surly kid with hairy arms to play the intern and hire McAndrews to play the wise old chief of surgery." "We will send Ben Casey and Kildare to the showers," cried Clendenin. "This man makes Sam Jaff and Ray Massey look like a pair of cut purses." "Clendenin, you've done it again." "So you'll con him into it, huh, Ira, baby?" "Depend on it." "It's you and me, kitty," said Clendenin, embracing Ira, "all the way to the top." "To the top," echoed Ira. "Now be a doll and let me go to work. Right after the show, I promise you I will turn the good doctor over my knee and give him such a gentle colonic he'll never even feel it." "You are a great human being," said Clendenin with reverence. He administered a final squeeze to Ira's shoulder and returns to the control booth. Ira reached his stool as his camera light went red. "You have just heard a powerful case made against food by Dr. Clara Salenko, a scientist of unquestionable eminence," said Ira to the audience. "I have with me now another scientist at least as eminent, in fact, a Nobel Prize winner in medicine, whose views are completely the opposite of Dr. Salenko's. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Dr. Andrew McAndrews." "Good evening," said McAndrews, pleasant, twinkling, comfortably erudite, wholly reassuring. "Doctor," said Ira, "you heard Dr. Salenko. Do you have some answers?" "Yes," said Doctor, "I have some answers. But I have a lot more questions than answers." For example, said Dr. McAndrews, "if you are the boss of a multi-million-dollar food company, what sense does it make to go around poisoning your customers?" Next question. "If female hormones used to fatten cattle induce sterility, how do you account for the population explosion?" Next question. "If flies and mosquitoes develop an immunity to DDT and other pesticides, why can't people do the same?" Next question. "If Americans are consuming poisons in ever-increasing amounts, why are we getting bigger, stronger, smarter, and longer-lived?" "Excuse me, sir," said Ira, "but it's Dr. Salenko's contention that compared to the year 1900, we are undoubtedly living longer, but most of us are walking around half sick." McAndrews chuckled. "Most of us, Mr. Shapian, are walking around with a Blue Cross card in our pockets or some other form of group insurance. When we get an ache, we go to a doctor. Why not? It's free, isn't it? So that makes us a medical statistic, just the fact that we visited a doctor's office. Now, back in 1900, the only people who went to doctors were the very rich and the very nearly dead." Said Ira. "Never thought of it that way." "Here's something else to think about. Let's take Dr. Salenko's indictment of pesticides. I won't argue that there haven't been a handful of deaths caused by pesticides, probably not as many as has been caused by aspirin, but as I say, I won't argue. I will only make these points. In the north of Italy, when pesticides were introduced after the war, crop yields increased by 1,000%. Yes, young man, those are the actual figures. And here's more. Spain, which since the beginning of time has been an importer of food, has become an exporter of food since they started using pesticides. Mr. Shapian, it is the business of chemistry to take intelligent risks. Yes, there is danger in pesticides. For that matter, there is danger in pie, in bathing, and in air conditioning. But I say when you balance the benefits against the hazards, when you consider that every day there are millions more people who must be fed, pesticides are not only a risk science must take, but a positive duty science dare not shirk. Clendenin, sitting in the control booth, watching McAndrew's potent counterattack, beamed all over his face. Ah, shut up, growled Jefferson Tatum. Clendenin folded up his smile and tucked it in his conniving heart. Dr. McAndrews, legs crossed, speech folksy, facts marshaled in long, serene ranks, continued his gently lethal rebuttal. Ira moved back out of camera range, figuring this wise old man needed no assistance. Behind the cameras, listening to every word, stood Dr. Clara Selenko, her handsome face a mask of battle. Ira took pains not to get too close to her. Now, folks, said Dr. McAndrews, let's take a look at antibiotics, which Dr. Selenko holds up as such a ghastly threat to life and limb. Of course, there is a tiny percentage of people allergic to antibiotics. We all know that. But do you have any idea what the adding of antibiotics to cattle and poultry feed has done for the production of edible protein? The increase is amazing. Fantastic. And this is a hungry world we live in, folks. Just because one man in 50,000 gets a rash from oreomycin, should we go back to the good old days when half our farm animals died? And even the ones that lived were scrawny runts compared to what we're getting today. And here's something else to mull over. Dr. Selenko showed us some pretty horrible sights, like cages full of mice dying of bladder cancer they got from eating butter colored with AB yellow. Now, I don't doubt for 1 minute that Dr. Selenko gave those mice cancer by feeding them butter. But what else did she feed them? There's the question. What else did they eat besides butter? Any of you folks out there know a human being who goes through life eating nothing but butter? Me personally, I'm going to be 70 years old next birthday, and I never yet met a man who ate nothing but butter. Maybe if Dr. Selenko fed her animals a balanced diet, the kind you and I eat, and I include butter, well, maybe her experiments would have come out a whole lot different. Ira held up one finger, warning McAndrews as he had 1 minute left. The doctor acknowledged with a slight nod. One last point, said Dr. McAndrews. First, let me state clearly and emphatically that Clara Selenko is a woman of sterling character and flawless medical credentials. I specifically exclude her from the group I'm about to name. But don't you find it interesting that most people who write books and give lectures on health foods have one thing in common, a prison record? Ira signaled 1/2 minute. A few are doctors who have been arrested for malpractice. Most are quacks who never saw the inside of a medical school. For every honest woman like Clara Selenko, there are 100 pitchmen and snake oil peddlers. They're dealers in overpriced foods, phony machines, worthless cookware, but mostly they're dealers in fear. Be smart, friends. Don't swallow their sucker bait. The final commercial went on. Thank you, Dr. McAndrews, said Ira. If you'll just sit where you are, I'll bring in Dr. Selenko and we'll wind up the show right after this commercial. Ira hustled to Dr. Selenko's side. Doctor, would you mind taking that stool right over here? Grimly, silently, she allowed Ira to escort her to a stool next to Dr. McAndrews. Good evening, Clara, he said amiably. Hi, Killer, she said. Ira sat on the third stool and tried to think. In fewer than 60 seconds, no, in fewer than 45 seconds now, he was going to perform the single most decisive act of his life. He was going to burn his bridges to commercial television beyond any hope of restoration. He was going to make his name anathema for all time, wherever men gathered to use the public airwaves for profit. It was his Rubicon, his blast-off, his moment of truth. Was he afraid? He did not know. His face, covered with TV makeup, could not show paleness. The hollowness in his belly seemed neither vaster nor smaller than when he first heard Gabriel's tape recording and made the fateful decision. He felt no hesitancy and yet no eagerness. He had no clearly defined impulse either to advance or to retreat. But it was now academic whether he was afraid or not. The red light on the camera glowed brightly. The assistant director's finger was aimed at him like a spear. Even if he wanted to reconsider, did he? Did he not? There was, in any case, no time. When doctors disagree, said Ira to the camera, what are we poor laymen to believe? Dr. Selenko, are you prepared to amend anything you said? Not in the slightest, she declared. Dr. McAndrews, said Ira. I'll play my hand, said McAndrews firmly. Is there no area where you two great scientists can reach any common conclusion at all? None, they replied in unison. Ira took a breath. Now came the bombshell. I recollect one occasion when you two were in agreement, he said. You both, I believe, were members of the Surgeon General's panel on smoking. Oh, well, you're talking about cigarettes now, not food, said Dr. McAndrews. Cigarettes are, of course, poisonous and carcinogenic, added Dr. Salenko. Yes, said Dr. McAndrews, and unquestionably our biggest single cause of heart disease. In the control booth, Clendenin was leaping wildly at the switches, tripping over himself, ripping his black suit on knobs and handles, tangling limbs with Jefferson Tatum. But too late, too late. It had all gone out over the air. Thank you, doctors, said Ira softly. This is Ira Shapian saying goodnight for, and to, the Star-Spangled Broadcasting Network. Ira slipped off his stool. Making a wide circle to avoid the personages exploding out of the control booth, he opened the side door of the gym and dashed into the cold night.